Hello. And we were talking, we've had her on as well, her book, Hannah's Children.
Right.
And
Yes.
Catherine was so lovely. She really spoke of you so warmly. We were having a very nice talk about she's going to come visit us here in Massachusetts in a few weeks. And she was just mentioning that out of all the people in her life who have been kind to her and helped her, you stand out.
Well, that's
And
very that's kind of Catherine. And we have a full kind of crop of family books out, as you know, Frank, between my book, her book on large families, and then Tim Carney's book on sort of family unfriendly. So there's just a lot of us
yeah,
looking at the
well,
character of American Family Life right now.
yeah, make sure you send Ernie, my producer, the Tim Carney connection
Okay.
because we're doing a lot on this subject and I've been following your work for a long time in other places besides the book, and I've of course read the book, and I've read Catherine Packlock's book. I'm in the middle of Paul Morland, who's a demographer from the UK, who's written a book called Tomorrow's People, and he's got a new book coming out soon called No One Left. And I heard him on the BBC the other day, and it sounded like you talking in terms of the statistics and everything else. So, you and Catherine are not by yourselves in this.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. There's a lot of people who are kind of looking up and looking around and just sort of seeing the trends, not just kind of in marriage and fertility, but just kind of seeing the dynamics play out among young adults today. And as you
Yeah,
talk to, my students, for instance, at UVA, I think there's just kind of pervasive worry about their prospects for dating and
yeah.
marriage that tell me this is more than just a more than just a stats, game, basically.
Yeah, so let me introduce you properly. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. I am Frank Schaeffer. This is a podcast, goes live on YouTube and goes to many, many places after that as both a podcast as well as a video. And today, my guest is a professor of sociology and director of the National Marriage Project, Brad Wilcox, who also happens to teach at the University of Virginia. And this is his new book called Get Married: Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. And I just hold this book up, but the main thing I want to do is show you all my notes in the pages here, Brad. It's a very well thumbed, well underlined book. And the first thing I want to say is, first of all, just a really big thank you for the years of work you've put in on tracking this. I've read articles by you. I've seen you cited everywhere. Your friend, Catherine Packalook, and her book, Hannah's Children, she credits you with opening a lot of doors for her personally, but also just your work. So I think of everyone that I've talked to who is concerned about demographic issues, the decline of population, the inability of younger people to make romantic relationships that stick these days, waiting to have children, to the cusp of infertility, all of this stuff. Um, all I would say by way of introduction is you bring a kind of dispassionate professorial view with your facts and your numbers and your charts and your graphs, but I think there's a human side that comes through where, you happen to love and care for human beings and you feel there's a sense of compassion between the lines here for something that I feel very strongly about, and that is just the missed opportunities to live and to enjoy life. And I'll end this little monologue here by just giving you a little personal history to set this up. My wife Jeannie and I'm 71. We've been married now for 53 years. She got
Okay.
pregnant when we were 17 and 18. We have 3 adult children, 5 grandchildren, 3 of whom live across the street from me. Um, After I finish this podcast, I'll be picking the youngest up at school, as I have picked these kids up every day and cared for them for the last 15 years. And I'll just end this by saying that I bring a very personal thing to this subject in the sense that um, as I look back over a writing career, I've had some novels that have done well, and I've had some books that have done things, and all this stuff. At 71, pushing 72, the only thing that actually stands out in my mind that I have no second thoughts about is the investment of time, energy, care, and love that I've had in my own family and that I have received back again. Case in point, this morning, my 15-year-old who lives across the street, who's missing school because she has a sore throat, texts me Bob, BA, she calls me as her grandfather. I'm stuck at home today. Could you please cook lunch and bring it over? All right. Being asked to do that,
Right.
that's why I got up this morning,
Yep.
not to do this podcast, not to write another book, which I happen to be working on. In
Sure.
terms of what really meant something to me in this 24-hour period, a 15-year-old asking me to cook lunch for her and
Right.
expecting that I would, did more for me in terms of my life, raison d'etre, if you want to put it that way, than anything that happened today. So I just want to introduce this book, Get Married, Why Americans Must Defy the Elites and Forge Strong Families and Save Civilization. And just say that, Brad, I think that this isn't just sort of an important subject. I can't think of anything more important to the future of not just humanity, but individuals' ability to access joy, period. I will now shut up and ask you about the book.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would just quickly say in response to your great opening monologue there, that my wife actually coined sort of this idea of the Midas mindset that's afflicted, I think, so many of us, especially younger adults. Just talking to some students at lunch today from UVA, and they're kind of saying that a lot of their peers are just completely fixated on, economics and the comm school and grades, and they're not interested kind of in learning for learning's sake. And it's because this Midas mindset has kind of captured their hearts and minds. You're really kind of wanting to excel professionally, they want to excel financially, they want to build their own brands and their own careers, not recognizing that, as Aristotle said, we're social animals, and that our ties with others, with friends and family, end up being a lot more important for us than, what kind of degrees on our wall or how much money is in our bank account. So that's where we're on this, we're starting on the same page here, Frank, with that recognition, I think.
Yeah, I just want to mention one other thing before we dig into the book, and I have a whole bunch of quotes I'm going to read and talk to you about. And that is, I just want to ask you and say that if it's okay with you, we would like to make your book, Get Married, Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization, our It Must Be Read book club for June. And we're also offering Catherine Pakaluk's book, Hannah's Children. And the next person we're interviewing soon is Paul Moreland on this whole demographic thing. So we've got a series of books that we're using to really try to hammer home the fact that this is a kind of a non-negotiable subject that has to be dealt with. But with your permission, we'd like to make Get Married a book club offering with our book club.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thanks for making that selection, Frank.
Yeah, yeah. Well, as I said, when you're talking about demographic decline, you're discussing a big issue, the likes of which we haven't really seen statistically since the Great Plagues and the Black Death in Europe and that kind of population decline. But let me just talk a little bit about your book here and dig into part of it. And I say that Get Married, Why Americans Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization should be quoted and read. So let me read something from your book. So many of our broader unfolding crises can be seen in the context of this core social unraveling. Collapsing rates of marriage and parenthood drop as we see surges in antisocial political extremism, a loneliness crisis, addiction to technology, and economic inequality. Meanwhile, elites who have the money to insulate themselves from these crises continue to promote anti-nuptial and anti-natalist ideas that make them worse. Our elites will push nearly any other solution besides marriage and family. They'll argue that we need to deepen our dedication to work, have the government fund childcare, spend more on education, expand access to contraception, or spend more on cash welfare programs, including a universal basic income. The default assumption underlying many of these proposals is that people are autonomous, isolated individuals. So the state and the market should step in to reinforce our interdependence and reduce the value and power of family ties. I think there's so much about your book that's fascinating to me and important, but one of them is this disparity between the way the elites behave and what they sort of have been telling other people to do for a long, long time. And, I'm 71, 72 years old, so I kind of remember the sexual revolution. And basically, I want to trot an idea out to you. I want to go to what you say in your book, but I also want to throw in my 2 cents worth here. It seems to me that the reaction against traditional families is because our elites who tend to be more liberal, and I consider myself of the left, by the way, oddly, to frame this, have confused their pushback against what they regard as Christian taboos and the restrictions of Christianity and religion that we need to be liberated from, for instance, in marriage or fidelity or children or any of these other things. And what they don't seem to understand is that these impulses have nothing to do with Christianity, but have to do with the most basic prime directives of our evolution, without which we cannot feel fulfillment. So whether you're a believing Christian or not a believing Christian has nothing to do with the fact that our impulse to mate, bond, care for children, this goes back into our hunter-gatherer phase, which is non-negotiable. This is who we are. So I just think that the elite's attitude towards marriage, fidelity, and childcare is rooted in a weird kind of pushback against Christianity that goes all the way back into, the work of people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Voltaire and so forth, but is misunderstood as pushing against Christian taboos that are old-fashioned and need to be moved. We got to move past this. And what has been misunderstood is that Christianity or Islam or these other things may teach these things, but only because they correlate to a deeper evolutionary truth. That's my own view. It's not what's in your book, but I just toss that out as a kind of my view of what you're interpreting as an elite hypocrisy.
So what I would just add to that, though, Frank, is that there's a relatively new book by Nicholas Christakis at Yale in sociology, and he talks about kind of like there are these two fundamental human impulses that are kind of like shaping culture. And one tend to get more play than the other, depending upon the culture. And one is towards towards pair bonding and towards, family and intergenerational ties. But one is towards sort of multiple sexual partners and kind of keeping your options open, having more choices. And there's some cultures that, would tend to sort of prioritize that latter strategy. And so I think what my book is about, in part is kind of helping people recognize that the sort of the desire to kind of build up the pair bond in the context of marriage and a broader family life, is a sort of a civilizational pattern that we see, obviously not just in Christian civilizations, but in, in India and in Egypt and in Nigeria and in China at different, points in time and even now, obviously, today in some important ways as well. And so, again, this idea to think that marriage and family are, these sort of Christian, cisgendered, patriarchal, things kind of loses a much deeper and richer cross-cultural and historical understanding of the way in which love, sex, family, marriage have kind of rolled out. And if we want to kind of, forge stronger families, we've got to recognize that marriage is the foundation. And yeah, that's not going to mean going back to 1955, but it doesn't mean kind of wholesale abandoning this fundamental pair bond and a set of norms and values that sort of wrap around it and sustain it and protect it. And this goes back to the Christakis point from a strong alternative, which is that, people often are attracted to a wide range of partners. And if that's going to be kind of, your model of how to organize your life, it's going to mean a very different way of organizing your society, your family life, and especially your kids' worlds than one that's more focused on building up those pair bonds in the context of marriage.
Yeah, and I mean, the point you make in your book, and you bear it out with all the statistics very forcefully, is just that demographically, I think the question we can ask everybody at this point, whether it's related to the sexual revolution or the kind of jobism of the kind of career orientation of our whole culture that you were talking about before I introduced you with your own students who wrote, it's all about the money, the kind of Midas thing. The question we can pose people, given statistics of loneliness and dissatisfaction, and especially female dissatisfaction and unhappiness these days, is how's all this working out for you? And so I think at some point we need to do what you're doing here in your book. And I think your subtitle's so important, Why Americans Must Defy the Elites and Forge Strong Families and Save Civilization. What's your theory on why our elites, which I read as the knowledge class, particularly white, particularly university-based, particularly media-based, the sort of people who decide on what articles are in the New Yorker or op-eds in the New York Times, this class of people never meets an idea that disparages traditional relationships that they don't somehow want to like. And then when that doesn't work, they move on and they go to the next one. Just to stop on that point for a minute, what do you think the motivation is? And this is not a rhetorical question, it's a real question. Why the hell for the last 50, 60 years has this been the thing? Why this sort of love of the unconventional and disparaging of everything that goes right back into hunter-gatherers 80, 90,000 years ago and has never changed since then, except for this tiny sliver of modernity we live in? What's the deal here? Why?
Well, I mean, I think affluence, obviously, at scale gives people more freedom to do as they, as they please and as they choose. And I think, that the fact that we live in a relatively affluent society that accords us a certain measure of independence from, marriage and family and from religion and other, core communal traditions, gives people a much more individualistic kind of orientation to life. And then you have a kind of a deep assumption that progress is, kind of intrinsically good. And so I think anything that's sort of seen as an indicator of progress, any departure from the archaic and antiquated, ideas and norms of yesteryear is kind of just assumed to be good. And there isn't kind of a recognition on the part of many of our, culture shaping elites that yes, some traditions must be jettisoned, some traditions are wrong, some traditions are evil, but many traditions sort of emerged over time, evolved over time to kind of serve an important social function. And to kind of, give you one example of what I'm thinking about here, I would just mention, monogamy obviously is there are many different models like we were talking about before, but what monogamy does is it kind of channels, people's sexual and romantic directions and in one way that tends to support a more stable family life and a more just and actually egalitarian society because, more people have access to partners and families, and you're not kind of letting a smaller group of, elites with either more, financial resources or more physical strength or whatever else they might have, status, lord, or accumulate, all partners or a large number of partners, I should say, to, to themselves, exclude people. So this whole push right now for polyamory just, I think, ignores how much monogamy tends to actually serve the welfare of a large number of adults and also tends to support the social order. We have good evidence, for instance, indicating that when there are more monogamous unions, there's less crime, for instance. And then, of course, too, that we know that men are more likely to engage, meaningfully in the lives of their children in monogamous communities than in communities where they're organized along polyamorous or polygamous or other kinds of, non-monogamous foundations. So I think, again, the polyamory has been embraced recently because it's the newest thing. It's the shiny bauble, and it's seen as a repudiation of those archaic, conservative or Christian ideas about marriage and family. But you and I understand and appreciate that monogamy actually does a lot more than just, signal perhaps and, a religious idea about marriage and family.
Yeah, I think one of the ironies you point out in your book is there's this sort of weird mirror image between supposed opposites. When you understand that what Andrew Tate says about women mirrors exactly what people in the antenatal aspect of the feminist movement in the 1970s sort of were pushing for in that, there are actual quotes from him, which are kind of mind-boggling, where he says the problem is there is zero advantage to marriage in the Western world for a man. And then Tate says there's zero statistical advantage. He adds, if you use your mind, if you use your head instead of your heart, and you look at the advantages of getting married, there are absolutely none. So, the funny thing is you just take his name out, put that in The Guardian by some feminist arguing for single and loving it, and you've got the same thing. So it's very odd that they wind up at the same place.
It's the horseshoe theory of marriage and family now. The sort of feminist left and the red pill right have a very similar take on love and marriage and family, but one is targeting women and one's targeting men. But they're both equally anti-natal, anti-nuptial, turns out.
Yeah, and of course, your book lays it out in a way that talks about the fact that this is not a North American problem only. I've been reading some good articles trying to unpack what's going on in Korea, South Korea and North Korea, as a matter of fact, and China and many, many other cultures. Japan, of course, being notorious, falling below replacement level. Your book is all about this as well. The book, again, Get Married, Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. And we're going to be making this a part of our It Has to Be Read book club in June. But one thing that I just want you to talk about a little bit is these are different cultures, very opposite in terms of immigration policy and everything else. They face the same problem, an aging population, less people to support them. But uh, one thing you talked about the polyamory kind of trend now. The conceit of a lot of these movements that appeared at first to be anti-marriage and so forth is that we're doing some new thing. But
Right.
actually, ironically, none of this is ever new. All of these things have been tried in various cultures. None of them have worked. And in the end, some form of monogamy survives the experimentation. And I think most recently of the sort of glamour and glitz that used to surround the Playboy Mansion, Hugh Hefner, how cool this was. Johnny Carson had him on repeatedly. Oh, lots to joke about, all kinds of celebrities coming through. As the years go by, the blush wears off. It's
Mhm.
sordid.
Yeah.
This is a crappy place to be. Faded curtains, dog crap all over the place. He's wandering around his pajamas trying to have threesomes, popping Viagra till midnight. All his celebrity friends come in. They're a bunch of losers. But it takes 30 or 40 years for that to kind of come out. And then by that time, you're into the next thing. And of course, when it comes to the polyamory thing, there was a commune in New York in the 1960s that tried all this and had horrible experiments in terms of having children raised in the commune and so forth. The New Yorker had an article about it. None of these things have ever ended well. And in terms of the form of marriage that you talk about, however it manifests culturally, my guess is that eventually that will re-emerge, called whatever you want to call it, because even from the point of view of how children fare within those sorts of relationships, back in the 1960s, I was growing up in a Swiss community that had refugees from hippie communes where people had been raised in these. These were not happy campers. They didn't do well as human beings. So just talk a little bit about that kind of direction, that sort of repetition of the experiment, always billed as some new shiny object. It's not new shiny at all. This has all been done before.
Yeah, well, I begin the book talking about the 1970s, which obviously Tom Wolfe described as the me generation. There's just kind of
Yeah.
this massive turn away from traditional mores. There was a massive turn away from religion in the 70s, and people were engaged in a variety of experiments, with living, sex, marriage, family. Obviously, this is the decade when divorce skyrocketed in American life. And there was kind of, even at that point, I think the sense that like, well, if at least adults are happy in the moment, then their kids will be happy. And so kind of a massive turn away from, a lifelong view of marriage, a lifelong ethic of marriage. And what's striking about this is not only were the kids often messed up by the divorce revolution, we now have the receipts on that in the studies that have been done since the 70s on the negative effects of divorce. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but we also see what's striking too is you would think, given the fact that marriage became a lot more fragile in the 70s,
Mm.
that the remaining marriages, Frank, would be happier. I mean, the sort of theory of the case was that we're getting rid of all those unhappy marriages, and
Yeah.
so the folks who are left over are going to be just blissful, basically. And yet, when you track the quality of marriages across the 1970s, what's called the general social survey, what you see is that marital happiness is declining as well. So marriage is declining, the divorce rate's rising, and marital happiness is declining. And there
Mm.
could be obviously a number of reasons why that's the case. But from my perspective, I think a big part of the story there is that couples who were still married in the 70s had this massive sort of like gray cloud of uncertainty hanging over their
Mm.
marriages
Mm.
as they saw friends and family members get divorced and so many needless, marital breakups, kind of surround them. And so what's weird to think about our moment right now is that a lot of the arguments that are being articulated in the public square that I talk about in the preface to my book, from like a law professor in the Bay Area, kind of celebrating her divorce or expressive divorce. She acknowledges her husband's a good guy. She loved him, but she just wanted more time for her own career and other things, right? Her style of argumentation, Frank, is so parallel to many of the arguments that were articulated in the 1970s about
Yeah.
the need for an expressive divorce. And of course, too, the whole polyamory thing sounds a lot like, the swinging 70s, the open marriages of the 1970s as
Yeah.
well. Not a recognition that, look, we've been there, we've done that. It didn't work
Tried
out well
this.
for the kids and actually for the adults too, ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, I feel as someone who's a little older and I've read some books and been in the movie business as well, it literally the old phrase, hey, I've seen this movie. There's
Right,
nothing that any of these people are saying that I haven't heard a dozen times before in another
right.
context. My wife went to the Boston School of Fashion Design and she'll walk down a street and she can actually name the date of the new thing that's in a window and she'll say 77, 86. She's seen
Right.
these
All these
these
things that
fashions
happen.
just recycle. Well, it's the same with these. And you write, I think it's from the forward of your book, taken together, writes Wilcox, I'm just quoting you here. This elite messaging, largely from the left, leaves the distinct impression that the path to prosperity, a meaningful life, and happiness leads away from family foundation towards singledom, work, and travel. And then you add, this advice is seductive in our individualistic age, so long as you never looked at the actual statistics. And then, of course, you go on and look at the statistics, which literally, in a fact-free environment, I guess these days we don't hear much about statistics, but when you do look at the statistics, they give exactly the opposite truth when it comes to contemplation of who is, if it's all about the money, which is not why you get married, but if that's all there was, the argument still is for people cohabiting, sticking together, marrying, having children, staying the course, and they wind up with a lot more money and prosperity if that's your only measure, which would be pretty bleak
Right.
if that was it. But
But it's important, I think, I think in a day and age, we got an article in Family Studies, which is a blog that I help, to edit. And our entry today is on by a scholar of homelessness.
mm,
And what he's doing is just looking at trends in the number of older adults, seniors who are living alone.
yeah,
And what he is thinking about is the way in which, because of the rising share of childless adults we're going to see rolling out now, when they hit their 60s, 70s, and 80s, they're going to be a lot more likely because they have no kin to end up
mm,
homeless, at least on current course, right?
mm,
And so the point to sort of think about here, and I talk a lot about happiness in the book, but just in terms of basic financial security and then also social solidarity, in the absence of kin,
mm-hmm,
there are going to be a lot of what China calls bare branches,
yeah.
no one to kind of support them and help them as they navigate the challenges of midlife and then late life. And so, even if you were just thinking about money, it'd be worth kind of maybe revisiting your perhaps indifferent orientation towards marriage and family, because unless you're really wealthy, Social Security is not it's not going to be
Yeah.
a great gig for a lot of us in that older moment.
I want to get back to something you do, and I forget the page again, but you talk about communion, children, commitment. You have a list of things, and I'm going to go through them: cash, community, and I'm going to get back to that in a minute. But one of the things I want to just throw out there for you, and it's very much ripped from the headlines of my own life, is because Jeannie and I got married so young and had children, and that my daughter got married fairly young, dropped out of NYU, got married, moved to Finland, raised her kids there. She happens to be the CEO of a company in New York now, so she's a good advertisement for marry young and have kids first, then do your career. Actually wrote me an email knowing that I'm interested in the subject, saying, when I do board meetings with my board and people ask me how I became a CEO so young as a woman for an investment company, I tell them I didn't learn anything from the business community. I learned by being a mother. Catherine Pakaluk would like the email.
Sure.
But one thing I want to talk about that goes unsaid too much, that is implied by your book in terms of this whole demographic breakdown, is the lack of intergenerational connection. And I can't imagine my life without daily involvement with my grandchildren in terms of my own satisfaction as a human. But from everything that I've read about studies of longevity, of things that contribute obesity, smoking, the Berlin study, for instance, found that regular care of grandchildren for an elderly person is one of the single biggest determining factors on both quality of life and longevity. Added 7 to 10 years in a study that went on for 20 years with many, many thousands of people. Same for kids. People who grow up with a relationship that's close with an elderly person have a completely different view of aging for themselves for their entire life. Talk a little bit about the fact that if you wait to bond at all, you're not dating in college, you're not falling in love, you're waiting until you either have that PhD or your career going. Then finally, maybe you marry if you're part of this hypocritical elite. You're freezing some eggs along the way, whatever it may be. Eventually, you have this child. By this time, your own parents are the age Jeannie and I were for our second batch of grandchildren.
Right.
You're caring for an elderly person. People are off in these 55 and over communities away from their grandchildren. Everybody's moved 7 times anyway for their job. It just seems to me that one of the big untalked about things that no one wants to go to, because it kind of, again, is like, okay, how's this working out for you when it comes to the loneliness factor, is we have smashed the intergenerational connection. I just would like you to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so what we see oftentimes today, especially in more educated circles, and this is so it's important to note that I think in many respects our elites do a pretty good job of getting married, staying married, and having reasonably happy family lives. But one thing they tend to do is postpone marriage and postpone parenthood. And if that goes across more than one generation, as you know, then you're talking about becoming a first-time grandparent, maybe when you're 70,
Yeah.
or 72 or 3. And then when your grandkids are, 10, not to mention heading into high school, then you're in your 80s, right? And so
Yeah.
that I think is a much less appealing way of being a grandparent than what we've seen in our own family lives, where our own parents were kind of vital grandparents to their grandkids, to our kids and our nieces and nephews, when they were often their 60s, and now they're in their 70s and early 80s, and their grandkids are in their teens and early 20s. But they had kind of a very rich experience of being engaged with, their grandkids, because they were relatively young when they had, when my mom and my wife's mother were both in their 20s when they had their children. And so they benefited from that and being able to establish, very rich and active, physically active relationships with their grandchildren. Whereas the model that we're now seeing is one where it's going to be harder for, grandparents to be as physically active and as practically engaged, if they're really kind of entering their grandkids' school age years, in their late 70s and 80s.
Yeah, and I just want you to comment on the thing. I mean, I'm not saying this is exactly the way you stated in your book, but it just seems to me that in a day and age that's worried about microplastics and additives in food and genetic engineering of wheat crops and so forth, all of which is valuable to think about, but we have indulged in we've been blindsided by a very unnatural approach, if I can dare to use that word. I guess it's just as unfashionable as the word normal these days. But it seems to me that by getting away from the basic model that evolution and biology dictate, because fertility clocks haven't changed any to accommodate careerism, for instance. And whatever anybody thinks about completing an education before you even dare to fall in love doesn't change the fact that, when you're 30, 40, 50, different things are happening to your body and psychologically and so forth. Aside from the fact that the elites have been hypocritical about these issues and do for themselves, albeit belatedly, what they have not encouraged other people to do or helped other people to do, I don't hear much discussion of nature itself. You hear a lot in terms of the bleaching of reefs off Australia by global warming, but you don't hear about the price we pay for smashing intergenerational connection. You don't hear what it means to never live across the street from a grandparent who can help you. And I'll just give you an example of what happens when you are a little more hunter-gatherer like. We spent 98% of our human existence in hunter-gatherer clans that knew about childcare because there was always a grandparent there to help. Living across the street from 3 of my 5 grandchildren, they've never had any caregivers besides their grandparents, and both of their parents work. And we've been able to do that because we've been young
Right.
enough and so on. People say, oh, isn't this great? Well, you only have to go back a tiny little bit of time, and this is everybody. It's every Italian farm. It's every group of hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari. It's everybody. So when you cut that out because
Sure.
you've delay, you're basically, you know, giving the finger to everything human beings have been through history, and probably one of the big reasons we're still here, because there were always caregivers, because there were always grandparents.
Yeah, no, I think that's certainly true. I think also you even touched on something too that was relevant for your own kids, I think, and spouses as well. And that is that there's a lot of discussion today about kind of how do you juggle work and family, Frank?
Mm,
What I think people don't realize is that if you have, your parents or your in-laws, living in the same town with you, and you're all on the sort of broadly, family-friendly page together, and of course
yeah.
that's a big qualifier as well. I recognize that. But if you're kind of all kind of on the same page, roughly speaking, it makes that juggle a lot easier to have, grandmother, grandfather, maybe even uncles and aunts kind of in the same town or in the same area. And there can be a lot more intergenerational, care being extended towards, towards the grandkids and nieces and nephews in ways that make it easier for mom and dad
Mm.
to work, either at home in some kind of personal home-based business or remote work, or to work outside the home, of course, as well.
Yeah, it's funny because sometimes I have these discussions with people and they get their back up and say, oh, well, you must not favor women having careers because you talk about family. And I say, hey, hold everything just for 1 second. I've spent the last 15 years of my life making sure my daughter-in-law loves her career because she's never worried once about who's caring for her grandchildren. And this wasn't passed off to my wife in our home. I've done this just as much as my wife, Jeannie, has. In fact, in the last few years, Jeannie's been doing far less of it than I have. And it's been the best part of my life. My life would just seem unimaginable, like living with never seeing color or hearing music without the pleasure of helping with my grandchildren. It's been great. It's also been boring and difficult at times, but it's been great. And so, my view is not, oh, women shouldn't have careers. My view is, where the hell is everybody stepping up to help people have what they feel they need economically or career wise, but to do this as a whole family so that my daughter-in-law does have a career, but she doesn't have to agonize about who's taking care of her babies when she goes to work. Again, this is nothing unusual. This is the way everybody has always rolled, all the way from hunter-gatherers forward. So I would ask you a question before I get into your communion children commitment
Sure.
stuff. What has gone wrong in the sense that we don't hear more about this? We hear about polyamory. There's 10 articles on polyamory to every one that talks about the advantage of intergenerational connection. Why is that?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Frank. I think there's just a way in which in this moment people are looking for freedom from the encumbrances of family life. And so, polyamory is seen as one more way to kind of maximize your individual choices and options to pursue some kind of novelty that's going to bring you temporary romantic or, physical gratification.
Mm,
But we've just lost the plot, to use your film, um, note from earlier in the conversation, and
mm,
people just are blind to that which is most important to them. And again, I think if we had, more older people caring for their grandkids in the ways that you're talking about, both the kids would be less anxious and depressed, and the grandparents would be in better shape as well. And of course, I think it's important too I think part of the problem too is that so many of these conversations are driven by people who have a very kind of unique skill set and unique
mm.
set of resources. What's striking is so many of these articles are written by people in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Um, and I've spent just a little bit of time in Brooklyn. I don't really know Brooklyn, but there's just something about kind of, you've heard the phrase, what's the matter with Kansas? Well, what's the matter with Brooklyn? I don't know what is about
Yeah.
Brooklyn, but it seems to be kind of like this incubator for ideas that are anti-family. But also I think probably the kinds of people who flourish in Brooklyn have, certain social skills, certain kinds of economic resources that allow them to maybe juggle, more successfully. In this case, a kind of a polyamorous, set of
Yeah.
relationships. Whereas I think most of us, in back on planet Earth, I mean, it's tough for me to be as engaged and as attentive and as supportive of my wife, as I should be, right? And the
Yeah.
idea that I would have, not just one wife, but like two or three other people in the mix. I mean, it's just, I mean, from a purely practical perspective, it's just mind blowing. So it's just, it is interesting, I think, how a certain subset of the society, who may be either quite deluded about themselves and their
Mm.
capacities, or who have just unusual financial resources or social skills that can kind of do these things that, that are departing from the classic, monogamous norm.
Mm.
And, they may handle them okay, but let's face it, most of us won't be able to, and it just creates problems for us, for our kids, and for our communities.
Yeah, and I also think there's a built-in lie to the propaganda that goes for these sorts of ideas often. And again, having lived through the 60s myself, been
Right.
there, done that. My first paying job was working on the light show for the Led Zeppelin at the Montreux Festival. And, I've been there, um, helping set up the Strobe Club across from the Montreux Palace and the light show there and so on. We were going to liberate the world, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, blah, blah, blah. Turns out that it was just rock stars, some of whom I knew personally, raping 14-year-olds in hotel suites. This did not end well. Um, Kind of symbolized by the 3 feet thick of trash left by the Woodstock crowd. They left those fields muddy and trash ridden. Nobody cleaned up. Drugs were the same. I knew Timothy Leary personally. He came to visit us in our commune, stayed with us. The grand theory was this is going to expand our minds. 60 years later, the state of Oregon's trying to figure out what the hell to do, having legalized small amounts of possession of lethal drugs, 1,500 times more overdose in the space of 3 years. I've lived long enough to see how these cycles pan out. And they, basically, how the polyamory thing's going to end. When all the smart asses in Brooklyn are really done with everything 15 years from now, there's going to be a lot of regret. But what won't happen is an ability of people to go back down, nose their way back down that forest path to where they decided to try this and put their lives back together because they will have lived their lives. And that's what happens. So,
And not like that, but there's going to be, a whole class of ordinary Americans, and working class and poor Americans who got the message that polyamory was a great thing, and they've wrecked their lives and their kids' lives because they took this message in and lived out, a situation that just put them and their families at risk of, dissolution and disaster.
yeah, and one thing that I urge people when you read the book, Get Married, Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization, literally one thing that is inarguable. So you can hate Brad Wilcox and call him whatever you want to call him, or hate me for bringing these points up. But one thing you can argue with is that on the present trajectory line, except for sub-Saharan Africa, for a little while, but even there, we are facing a global problem where our entire social structures of multiple societies are going to topple, and all you have to do is do the math. And I've been talking with Paul Moreland, Tomorrow's People. We'll be talking with him and so forth. This is, Brad's not making any of this stuff up. So whatever you ascribe the reason to, the fact of the matter is, not only was Malthus completely wrong, and not only was the population Paul Ehrlich completely wrong, but the real problem facing humanity now is an aging population, too few people to support them, and very unhappy young people who are committing suicide, self-harming, drug overdosing in droves.
Right.
The answer to the question of how is all this working out for you, maybe we're wrong in who we ascribe blame to. So if you blame the feminists, or you blame this, or you blame that, nobody can dispute the numbers. So talk a little bit about the numbers, and then we'll go to the communion children commitment bit of your book.
Sure. So I've been, kind of literally kind of sitting here in the sort of shadow of Monticello and Thomas Jefferson's influence in Charlottesville and UVA for more than 20 years. And of course, he's justly famous for penning Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. And
Yeah.
when it comes to each of those three, ideas, those three sets of words, when it comes to life, we've seen obviously in recent years surging deaths of despair. When it comes to liberty, often people thinking about kind of opportunities in the American dream. What we've seen is that there are millions of kids across America who have really no shot, poor kids, at realizing that American dream, that kind of economic liberty, if you will. And then when it comes to the pursuit of happiness, there's no question that across multiple different data sets, we're seeing happiness in America fall.
Mm.
So what we see when we kind of look at those numbers is often there's research telling us that sort of the number one or one of the top factors that's kind of driving these trends is either marriage in particular or a strong two-parent family system, more generally. So when it comes to deaths of despair, for instance, new work from Jonathan Rothwell at Gallup telling us that in his analyses, the top factor predicting kind of at the regional level deaths of despair was lower levels of marriage.
Mm.
And then a new piece of research from Chicago telling us that kind of the number one factor this economist came across when he was looking at this declining level of happiness in America was, again, fewer and fewer Americans getting married. When it
Mm.
comes to the economic dream piece, Raj Chetty's work at Harvard tells us the number one factor he found at the regional level was the share of two-parent families in a community
Mm.
was the best predictor of whether or not poor kids would rise,
Yeah.
into affluence as adults. So all I'm saying, I think, is that when the family breaks down, when marriage is weak, then so too is the broader social ecology.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing this both in terms of things like happiness, deaths of despair, and then also just sort of the ability of poor kids to make it in America today. So this is why I think the kind of conversation that we're having today is important, because human flourishing is tied very deeply and profoundly to strong and stable families.
Yeah, absolutely. And the numbers don't lie. And having been doing quite a bit of reading on this, one of the things I love about your book is that it's always lovely to run into something where you kind of know some of it because you've lived it. I know your book on two levels. One, I've been reading a lot of other people who corroborate what you're saying, but the other thing is my entire life experience affirms, and not just my life experience, the flip side of that in friends who had some very grand ideas in the 60s and the 70s and 80s and their approach to divorce or other things, it did not work out well for their children. I have seen this, with people I know. Anyway, so Get Married, Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. Please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack, it has to be said, frankschaeffer.substack.com. And please get married and read it and talk about it. Let's go to those points that I wanted to bring up here. Communion, a we before me approach, both in attitude and action to marriage, is key to marital success. Forging a sense of communion requires rejecting the individualistic ethos of our elite media, academic, and popular culture. You want to just talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, so when you kind of look at a lot of the discourse, about love and marriage and family life, you often get a kind of me first mindset that's being broadcast to you. This has come through when it comes to something as sort of quotidian as money. What we see is that there are a lot of financial professionals who are telling us kind of the best way to organize your finances is, if you're a couple, is to have his and hers accounts.
Mm.
One of the key sort of stars to Shark Tank kind of was making this case. I think last week it came across my screen, but Susie Orman is obviously the big finance guru as well, makes the same argument in her financial advice to people, but they're dead wrong.
Yeah.
Because marriage is about establishing, a we before me mindset and practice. And so what we see is the couples who merge their accounts, who hold their money in common, are much more likely to be flourishing, less prone to divorce, happier. And there's even good experimental evidence now from a new study at Indiana University showing that couples randomly assigned to joint accounts were doing much better than couples randomly assigned to two separate accounts.
Mm.
So kind of the experience of having to talk about your money together, think about your plans, for the future, hold each other accountable in terms of how you're spending your money. These are difficult conversations often to have in a marriage, as you know, Frank. But the point is that kind of not having them and not kind of having the sort of same financial perspective, at least to some important extent, is a
Mm.
much bigger problem for couples. That's just one example of how this sort of we before me mindset is better for couples when it comes to organizing their lives together.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, one thing I just wanted to ask you about before we can go through the rest of that list is we've been talking about elites a lot, using the word elite. I think I know what you mean because I've read the book, but for people who haven't read the book, you just want to take a minute and define
Yeah,
what we mean by the elites.
I use college educated, Americans, who are a little bit more than a third of Americans as a way to sort of signal that. But I'm really thinking of people who are kind of commanding the heights of the culture,
Mm.
journalists, professors, C-suite executives, politicians, Hollywood moguls, showrunners, those kinds of people. They're kind of setting the agenda for the culture oftentimes. And people will say things like, well, just because, someone I've got a friend at Brookings who says, well, just because someone at Brookings says that marriage is good isn't going to make working class Americans embrace marriage. And I'm like, well, of course that's the case. But I'm like, we have to think beyond just that particular, you know, platform and think about maybe if you were, a scholar at Brookings making the case for marriage, maybe the kinds of people who were running, Netflix, would think about, their movies and their shows in a different way,
Right.
which then have an impact on sort of working class and poor Americans and teenagers, and they're thinking about marriage. So it's these culture shaping institutions and individuals who kind of occupy them. Public school superintendents would be another example, or people who are writing curricula for public schools would be another example here too, that shape the culture that are so important. And unfortunately, then either oftentimes um, articulating this idea that marriage doesn't matter,
Right.
openly, family
Right.
diversity theory, or they're, a cat's got their tongue. They're just tongue-tied. They're unwilling to say anything about marriage for fear of being seen as, retrograde or impolitique or worse.
Well, one thing you talk about, and this does segue back into these points you're making, children commitment and so forth, is this odd situation where, parents on the one hand say they want their children to grow up with integrity and happiness and so forth, and then they are pushing them, hey, delay romantic involvement. You don't even have a crush on somebody in college because you're there for your education. They basically booby trap all the points of connection, and then there you are, 30 years old, looking at your phone trying to figure out what dating app to use, and having essentially again push back against all the normal hormonal biology of connection in favor of get ready for this big fancy career your parents have pushed you into. Before we do the finish of the recap here, just talk a little bit about how you talk about parents that push their kids
Right.
into this kind of diet of education and money making, getting ready to make all these fancy careers, never once anything that's going to lead them toward a joyful, fulfilled relationship life.
Yeah, so we saw a poll recently from Pew, and it told us that, parents tend to prioritize for their kids' education and career more than a marital future. So they were much more concerned about their kids' success in school and in work than they were their success when it came to, love and marriage. And
Mm-hmm.
that's emblematic of a trend we're seeing a lot today, including with, university students' parents. I mean, I can't tell you how many kids I've spoken to basically been told by their parents, look, college is not the time to
Right.
get curious about someone, not the time to even think about marriage. It's just about, maximizing your educational success and then looking towards your career for the next 10 years. And then there's kind of this assumption that they'll hit 28, they'll look around, they'll find the perfect, um, the perfect person, get married between 28 and 32, and everything's just going to be hunky-dory from there. And there's not a recognition, I think, on the part of parents today that the romantic and marital prospects,
Mm.
their young adults, are a lot more fraught. And so if you happen to meet someone, as I did at UVA, ironically enough, in my Nietzsche class, who ends up my wife, a couple years down the road, that's
Yeah.
actually often a good thing, that you have some, a lot of things in common. You've had a chance to sort of be with them in a pretty intense collegiate environment, gotten to know them pretty well, and maybe you can make a good judgment at that point that they would be great for marriage and family down the road.
Yeah, and also just again look at nature in terms of desire and youth. Youth is about falling in love. And this has nothing to do with being gay or straight or trans or whatever. Youth itself gives you that kind of foolhardy courage to do things, where later it's sort of more, and I think you made this point in something you wrote. I forget if it's in your book or one of your articles, but that, these kind of capstone and cornerstone marriages, the capstone version is more like a corporate merger. You've thought through all the ramifications, rather than the cornerstone where you get married, you throw your hat into the ring, for better or worse, you go forward, and then, you grow together as a unit. It's a completely different idea of a relationship.
Yeah, that's correct. So capstone is now the sort of model that a lot of our elites pursue, but a cornerstone model where you're kind of growing together,
Yeah.
you're figuring out your work, you're figuring out your traditions as a family, you're even figuring out kind of your routines around vacations oftentimes. And, often you're also more likely to have more kids and to be more connected to, your own adult parents and they to your children.
Yeah. Okay. So now back to my list here. The problem is, there's so much in your book to talk about that we'll just. But I want to get back to the way you do this wrap up. Okay. Number 2, children. Prioritizing the welfare of your children is also a mark of successful family first marriages. Husbands and wives who view raising children as a primary goal in life and spend a lot of time with their children, from frequent family chores to fun family activities, are generally happier in their marriages and less prone to divorce. That's a point you make.
Right. So I talk about 5 C's in the book. And the first we've talked about is communion, kind of that we before me approach. The second C is children recognizing that your marriage matters not just for you, but for any kids that you might have together. And we see as couples who kind of recognize that their kids benefit from their marriage are much more, not surprisingly, kind of averse to sort of thinking about divorce. They're not on that particular, item, they're not more happily married, to be honest. And I was kind of expecting that, didn't see that in the data, but they are much more likely to be kind of resistant to thinking about divorce as kind of an option for them. I think that flows from their, their commitment to their kids, and seeing kind of marriage as key to their children. But in terms of the practice, what we did see is that parents who had more family fun activities, things like going to the football game or going on a hike together, or going boating, beaching, whatever it might be, are happier. No surprise there, couples are happier. But what was most surprising to me on this particular kind of line of analysis was that families who did chores together, they had happier couples, happier moms and dads. And for us, Saturday morning is always a difficult time because it's chore time in the Wilcox household. And we've never had a lot of success with our kids kind of, doing chores on Saturday morning with any kind of enthusiasm. So it's just sort of amusing for me to just look at the numbers and see that couples who do chores with their, with their kids tend to be better off in terms of the quality of their married life.
Yeah. And you talk about commitment. Keeping divorce off the table is one key to succeeding at marriage today. Husband and wives who prioritize marital permanence and fidelity are much more likely to not only to be stable and happily married, because shared commitment fosters trust. And of course, the reaction was, well, of course, but the point is real there. If you just want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, no. So I mean, the idea, and again, this is like people would say, commitment's one of the strongest predictors of marital happiness. And on the one hand, that's a completely banal point to make, right? But then when you actually think about what does that mean in practice, Frank, that's the point here, right? So like every couple has, difficulties, conflicts, disappointments, all that, and if you keep the D word out of your thinking, out of the conversation, it just gives people a greater sense of trust and security. So they can have those difficult conversations, they can have that fight and move on without kind of worrying about ending up in divorce court. So that's important, obviously, the point that I make in the book. And then on the fidelity front, there are so many opportunities now, basically, to give people a time, attention, and more, obviously, outside of your marriage that they don't deserve and your spouse deserves. So opportunities, in the workplace or in social environments or whatever else, and then obviously even more opportunities now online where you can kind of follow people and DM people and do all sorts of other things online that, take you away from kind of devoting your, the time and attention you should towards your wife or husband. Some stranger or some former flame, as is often the case as you kind of read these stories. And so all I'm saying is that couples who are deliberate about kind of seeing fidelity as an important virtue to live out, both in person and in the virtual world, and then also kind of recognize that they've made a permanent commitment towards their spouse, and they're not going to kind of bring in the D word. And I'm not saying cases obviously involving things like domestic violence. I'm just thinking of in the ordinary conflicts
Sure.
that mark most marriages. Keeping the D word out of mind and out of the conversation is just so helpful in fostering the kind of strong and enduring marriage that most of us take a lot of not just joy in, but also a great sense of security in as well.
You talk about the fact that in the cash section that wives are especially likely to get and stay married to men who are good providers. You know, that's an interesting thing. And then, of course, you're not saying that women don't have careers, but women do want a partner who provides in various ways, emotionally, financially, and other things. If you just want to address how the numbers bear that out.
Yeah, I think it's striking. So I did not find, to your point, any kind of negative really effect of having a wife who's working outside the home. So that's, it's important to kind of make that point right from the
Sure.
get. But what I did find was that for women across the ideological spectrum, especially for mothers with kids in the household, having a husband who's employed full time is a big plus. And then also when it comes to both getting married in the first place, women are more likely to prioritize a guy who's got a decent job. And they're also a lot less likely to get divorced in the second place when their husband is employed full time.
Mhm.
Study out of Harvard showing that when the wife loses her job, no effect on risks for divorce. But when the husband loses his job, divorce risk goes up by 33%. It's a big effect. And so it just tells us, even in the 21st century, basically, that women are more likely to be looking for a guy who is a reliable worker, a reliable provider. And I think part of the challenge is we're seeing a lot of young men are less connected to full-time work. And so they're heading
Yeah.
in the wrong direction there. And we need to kind of reach our young men, our teenage boys, and sort of let them understand, like, look, if you would like to have a girlfriend, if you'd like to have a wife, if you'd like to have a good family down the road, then you need to be a lot more intentional about your approach to high school, your approach to college, or your approach to technical training or apprenticeship, whatever it might be. But like, have a plan and recognize that your capacity to do a decent job in the workforce is going to have a big impact on your success romantically, and then especially as a husband and father down the road, if that's what you might be inclined to do or called to do.
Yeah, your point on community, which is your fifth point, husbands and wives who surround themselves with friends and family who take marriage and family seriously are much more likely to thrive, especially in a world that discounts and disparages the virtues and values needed to create a strong family. You know, very much in the case of Jeannie and I, who were together when we were 17 and 18 and expecting a child, in a very, accidental situation, real teenager stuff. Amazing, you should have, if you'd been around then. I think I'm older than you, Brad, but if you had taken a bet, you could have won a lot of money if you bet for us, because I think a lot of people were betting against us. But one of the reasons that our marriage survived and then turned into something rather wonderful was that we had the good fortune of being in this little evangelical community. I've since left the evangelical faith. I've been known as a critic of the religious Christian nationalist movement. I don't like Donald Trump. I'm at odds with just about everybody that I come from in some ways. But one thing I have never done and will never do is disparage the fact that the community, the love, the care that was offered to this young couple, these teenagers that were Jeannie and myself, 60, when we were just kids back in the late 1960s. Without that, I don't think we would have made it. From a place to stay in my parents' basement, to the support of the community, to the childcare help I got from my friends and family and sisters. How are we ever going to be, and I'm going to end their interview here, but don't make it a brief answer. How are you and I and Catherine Pakaluk and Paul Moreland and others who are concerned about the demographics, just good old-fashioned humanists who hope there's somebody around to watch a movie or look at Botticelli's Primavera 1,000 years from now? How do we get to the place where families thrive again when we've smashed the whole idea of community into this sort of individualistic series of pursuits and egomaniacal self-meism? I just don't understand how Brad Wilcox, and Get Married, how do we call people to defy the elites and forge strong families and save civilization without also first recognizing that unless we have communities within which the younger couple can thrive, none of this happens? That's my own view. But how this is not a rhetorical question. How do we encourage people to receive the kind of compassionate care that I got in this evangelical community, having abandoned the theology, but nevertheless incredibly grateful
Sure.
for what Jeannie and I were given? I think this is a huge point.
Well, I do think absent a religious community, it's harder for folks. And,
Yeah.
that's why that chapter focuses more on religious communities, because there's such strong, social ties that tend to sort of orient those communities and give them the capacity to help people navigate the challenges of marriage and family life, as was the case for you and Jeannie as well.
Hmm.
But I do think we can kind of think about this in terms of not just sort of the church house, but also in terms of, the state house and the art house and the schoolhouse. And so in terms of those other three institutions, the state and the school and the culture, I think, absent some shifts in public policies to make marriage and family, more attractive and more accessible, absent some shifts in our schools to kind of tell a better story about what really matters in life. And again, it's not accumulating a lot of money or a perfect career, but it's about, the sort of the friendship and family piece. And absent a kind of a culture, a creative culture, in terms of movies and music and TV shows, but also now social media, that tells a better and more truthful story about marriage and family. It's going to be hard for people in more secular communities to create the kinds of families that you've been talking about today. So my hope is, and I'm focused not just on religious communities. I'm Catholic, but I certainly do kind of speak to religious communities in the work that I do, but I'm also speaking beyond them, and hoping that even my secular friends, both personal friends, but also kind of more broadly speaking, can understand and appreciate that, yeah, this is a very humane kind of set of concerns that we have. And absent a renewal of marriage and family life, people are going to be living very, I think, in the main, lonely, economically precarious, and meaningless often, and unhappy lives in a future where there are way too many kinless Americans. So that's the future I'm trying to,
Prevent.
prevent. And it's already unfolding, and obviously to some extent, there's going to be a larger share of folks who are going to be living without the benefit of a spouse and kids. But I think we could at least kind of reach the bottom here and then begin to push up in a better direction if we can make the case in a variety of different contexts for love, marriage, and children. That's what we're trying to do.
Just to end on a personal note, how does this play with you and your own students? I think in our little chit chat before we really got going here, you were talking about your students. Your students in college at University of Virginia, where you teach, must be aware of who you are and what you're saying. And so must students you speak to at other colleges and other places that are not related to church or anything like that. Do you ever find people who look at you as if you're from another planet and don't understand, but also perhaps people who do and say, yeah, this isn't working for me. I wish I had a relationship. I'm looking for one. I mean, what you're probably in touch with more people. You get the reaction. You're the canary in the coal mine. What are you hearing?
Well, yeah, on the college campus. Yeah. I mean, I think there are plenty of students who kind of come in and they've got a kind of conventional orientation towards, education, work, and family. They want to get married. They just want to wait until they're 28, 29, 30, 31, or 32, right? And so I think my challenge to them is to sort of encourage them to think about getting married younger, if they meet the right person. I'm not sort of saying get married at 22 for the sake of getting married at 22. I'm just saying, look, if you meet a great person in college, there's need to kind of wait until you're 28 to try to seal the deal. So that's one thing that I think that's challenging to them. But there's also a pervasive sense of fear about the future, and there's a fear that they're not going to find the right person. And so I think that fear, is actually helps it make it easier for me to make the case that I do, that you need to be more intentional today about dating and love and marriage than was the case for often your parents and grandparents. And so I think there, when we kind of go through not just the statistics, but sort of the sort of pathos that exists for a lot of young adults today, it's at that point that they're able to listen and hear what I have to say.
Yeah, just hope you keep working at this, because I can't think of anything more important. I mean, obviously, you can use you could say, well, the future of the human race depends on this, and in your case of study, in terms of the demographics, sort of demographic Armageddon facing so many cultures across the world, it's actually true. So get married. Why Americans must defy the elites. Forge strong families, save civilization. Brad Wilcox be our June book club offering, and we will be encouraging people to read that. I'm Frank Schaeffer. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. Please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack, it has to be said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And Get Married is part of our book club, which is It Has to Be Read. And I can't think of a more important book than this out there, period. And it's not just the math, it's the human happiness and the ability to access joy in this life and not be lonely. So I think, Brad, you're onto something immensely important. I really thank you for your work.
Thanks for having me on, Frank. I appreciate the good word.
Yeah, I really, really appreciate you very much, and all the best with what you're doing. Thank you.